Hello, and welcome to me wearing plaid and working on the same painting for 3 videos in a row right now. So here we go. Day number 16,421. With the black paint that I'm using here, I've got stand oil mixed into it so that it retains the gloss. There's a lot of mediums out there that will do that, but I find stand oil to be my medium of choice because it doesn't have any strange odors, and it's really just linseed oil heated to a certain temperature so that it polymerizes and has a bit of a different consistency to it. It's kind of almost like honey. So the first time that I ever used stand oil, I didn't like it because of that. That was many years ago, so I never used it. And then eventually I realized what it would do to my dark areas and keep them dark and almost making it look varnished. Now there's so many ways that I could go in this video, so many different things that I could talk about, because there's so many things that relate to a part of a painting like this where you have a figure in painting flesh and an object and hair. But I think the most relevant thing that I want to talk about, it relates to transparency and opacity and the customizable way that we treat the thickness of the layer of oil paint that we're working with. So in this case, I'm working on painting flesh, hair, flowers, and a tiny piano, like an opaque object that is, probably some kind of plastic or something. And I'm just looking for ways to represent those textures in the most suitable way. So I'll try to get a little bit meta here for a second if I can. You think about what paint is, right? I mean, it's a pigment suspended in usually linseed oil. If you were to paint a representation of paint, right? Like if you were to paint a painting in a painting, you're trying to represent a realistic version of oil paint. And oil paint is the best suited thing to possibly do that with, of course. So if we're painting something that is supposed to be completely opaque and flat looking and plastic, something like paint is the perfect medium to do that with if we get a perfectly opaque layer so that no light passes through it, right? Because that's what these actual objects are. Like if you're holding a plastic toy or something, like this little piano that I used as a reference, it was an actual like hard type of white plastic. So that actual object itself, I'm not seeing anything through it. It's completely opaque. The thing about flesh and even garments, especially flesh, it's so imperfect. There's so much incredible variation at the smallest degree with the different colors and hues that happen in flesh. It's not perfect. So if a person tries to paint something like flesh in the same way that they would paint an object, like a plastic object or a clay pot or something, then that's when you can run into problems of making a person look kind of plastic. And one of the best ways to customize that is to use the oil paint to its full versatility in terms of transparency. And you get so many variations just with the thickness of the paint alone, and not even adjusting, adding other colors and things into the mix. Like just one mix of paint straight off the palette, by working it in different ways and making sure that some parts are a little bit thicker than others, there's a lot of interplay there that will show the underpainting underneath. So if your underpainting is a little bit cooler, the parts where that paint is thinner will look cooler automatically. And it'll be so subtle, but those things really matter. Like that's one of the things I think that makes flesh feel like flesh compared to when you're painting a flat object like a piece of plastic or wood or a piece of wood that's painted. Think about that, right? Like if it was actually painted with oil paint and you're trying to represent that object with oil paint, perfect, right? But when we're painting something like flesh, we shouldn't be thinking of we're trying to make what is actually oil paint, we're trying to make that into something that it's not, which is flesh. So we're trying to create the illusion that, like skin is not perfectly opaque. There's so much variation in it. And so those variations happen automatically. As soon as you use a brush to put paint onto a surface, it's going to be imperfect. There's going to be subtleties in how thick the paint is in some parts compared to others. So we might as well keep that, because it's already there. It's just much more efficient to do that than to try to flatten the surface like a cartoon and make all the paint exactly the same thickness. So something that I often tell beginner oil painting classes is that a pigment like titanium white should not be treated as if it is in great quantity, and every time you sit down to paint, you might as well have a large amount on your palette. In an image like this, the highlights that I'm kind of working on right now in the flesh are nowhere close to 10 on the value scale, so they're nowhere close to titanium white straight out of the tube. And even the piano, that relative to the flesh and the garment looks very bright, is not 10 on the value scale. It's just below that. And so I will reiterate that as a painter, that's as far as we can possibly go, is 10 on the value scale, which is white straight out of the tube. So I almost personally treat it as like a sacred thing, that it's a very special occasion on a painting where I get to use that. It's like overexposure in a photo. That's generally a bad thing, right? If there's a lot of the photo that is completely white, like paper, and that's like our equivalent of looking at the sun as well. That's like as bright as it can possibly get. So we have to start to think about treating those highlights as very precious, rare things that we get to do after we've established all of the midtones and the darker shadows below them. So as my little brush wiggles around the surface and zigzags, I want to finish this off by talking about this technique in general. I know it's not for everybody. I think it requires way too much patience sometimes. It can take a lot longer than a more loose painterly style, but that's why I like it. I think because it's rare, then it becomes a commodity that is not so easily reproducible, and the proof of work, so to speak, is in every hidden brushstroke. And so on that note, why hide brushstrokes, right? I mean, through the history of painting, when photography came along, it changed everything, right? It made painting different, and it made people want to celebrate what paint is by letting it look like paint. And I still question myself on that quite often. I know that there are many ways to work. Of course, if one wants to make an image that looks perfect, you can always work digital and print it out. And my paintings have actually often looked in person almost like digital prints. I've heard people say that at an art fair, where they'd walk by and make a comment to the person they're walking with and say, "Oh, that's digital, so let's keep walking. We don't need to go look at that." And I found that kind of funny, because I mean, what does that mean, right? They didn't appreciate a digital print, but they would appreciate it if they knew that it was a painting. So there's something to this idea of proof of work and labor and the human hand, the purpose of human creation, in even though we know that it could be done in another way. There's something very special about that. And I think it's no coincidence that this is also a time of change in human purpose, when there's more artificial intelligence taking people's jobs. I think part of the resurgence and popularity of representational painting since the internet and especially Instagram is due to people desiring a resurgence of purpose. And so I've actually found that I've kind of given myself this massive task of self-designated purpose, or I'm giving myself an infinite job that will never finish by having so much to work on, which is exciting. So this last still image, or these last still images, are basically the finished work, still not varnished yet. So there may be a slight inconsistency in a couple of the shadow areas, but the main difference here that we hadn't seen previously in this video is the soft edges, especially on the top of the piano. I really wanted to get back after oiling out and make those edges soft as they could be. Same with the edge of the face, and especially the floorboards as well. I went back into that area quite a bit and warmed and softened the cracks in the floor. I had to add quite a lot of cadmium yellow deep and like a bright red when it felt like too much from close, but then from a distance it just seemed to kind of work. So this is the third last installment, I think, of my Guest of Honor painting. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon.